Tiffany Prete on the other side of the screen is uniquely qualified to talk about some of the issues that are in the news today with regard to residential facilities. She is both a distinguished educator with a doctorate in education, but also worked on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is also part of the Blood Reserve in Alberta. And Tiffany, we've now kind of exhausted my expertise. If you could orient us in time and space about the Blackfeet people and the Blood Reserve, the geography and the history, I think that'll get us going because a lot of people are thousands of miles away.
Sure, great. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. Oki, Nistu, Nidanagu, Apoyaki. My name is Tiffany Prete. I'm a member of Ghana of the Siksugate Titupi, which is the blood tribe of the Blackfoot Confederacy. And my people are signed part of Treaty 7. And so our traditional territory, we originally occupied the land from the north of the Saskatchewan River, which is where Edmonton is located in Alberta, east to the Sandhills in Saskatchewan, south to the Yellowstone River in the United States, and west to the Rocky Mountains. And Blackfoot Confederacy is comprised of 4 tribes. We have Siksika, which is by Calgary. We have Piikani, which is by Pincher Creek. And then my people are Ghana, and we are closer to Lethbridge. And then in the United States, in Montana, we have the Southern Piikani. And so those are the 4 tribes that make up Blackfoot Confederacy.
And by confederacy, political organization of cooperation, friendship, trade, etc.?
Yeah, we're all Blackfoot people. There are no other Blackfoot people in North America, and so we speak the same language, have very similar beliefs to one another. Our dialect is just a little bit different between each of the tribes. And so my people are actually, we are the largest land-based reserve in Canada. We're just short of being 1,500 square kilometers. We also have a very large band membership. We have over 13,000 members. And so we're very close to the Canada or United States border. We're about 20 minutes north of the border. So our traditional territory was both in Canada and the United States as well.
Now, I'm not playing dumb. I actually am dumb. You can ask my wife. With regard to the language you're speaking, I just know of Plains Cree and Oja Cree, perhaps more in Ontario. Tell me about the language.
I'm not really sure what you want to know about
Well,
it.
is it Plains Cree or is it a dialect, a version of? How would you describe the language if it isn't described adequately as Plains Cree?
Oh, it's not at all related to Plains Cree. It's a separate and completely different language from Cree. So we speak Blackfoot, and it's in some ways it's similar to other Indigenous languages in that it's a very descriptive language. So a lot of Indigenous languages are descriptive. So it's based on a lot of adjectives and describing what we see in relation to the season and as well as to our relationships with one another. And so it's describing our relationship with the earth, with our relatives, with the animals, within our, depending on what season it is as well. So it's that there's a lot of nuance within the language itself.
Now, would all 4 members of the Confederacy speak a very similar language, or would there be pronunciation or vocabulary or dialect differences?
It would be some differences in the pronunciation. And so I'm somebody who's been colonized and I don't speak it fluently. I hear from my relatives that when they do go to the other tribes that they can hear kind of those differences. So you can tell who's from which tribe based just on the way that they pronounce words.
All right, well, let's get into the issue of the day. And since you're an academic, I will use a bit of academic humor, it is said sometimes that an academic would rather use another academic's toothbrush rather than the other academic's terminology or jargon. And I will confess I am not using a certain word when we come to discuss residential facilities, because as Fred Sasakamu said in his book, very little was taught there. I think the contract was 3 hours of tutelage a day, so we really can't call it, many of them, much more than a facility. However, you delve into a residency, a residential, a boarding, and a day, and could you define those terms for me, please, because I'm not sure that's made the news and people are familiar with how different they were.
Sure. When we talk about residential schools, I think that's the most common type of school model that Canadians talk about when, we talk about Indigenous peoples going to these facilities. And it's going to be different for every Indigenous group. And so what I'm sharing is very specific to my Blood people. And we were unique because we are very large. We had a very large reserve. And so the government was able to build these different school models on our reserve. Other Indigenous communities and tribes, this might not have been what happened on their reserve. And so for my people, the Canadian government actually came up with several different school models to try and assimilate Indigenous children. So we have day schools was something that they first started off with. So children, they would create these schools just in the camps of where the Indigenous groups were living on the reserve. And so they called them villages, or they called them camps by the Canadian government and the different religions. And so they would create day schools in these camps and have the children come during the day. And then the children got to go home in the evenings, and they were finding that it wasn't working very well because the children didn't have to reinforce anything that they were learning at the schools, and particularly they weren't really learning the English language because they were still using Blackfoot in the home. And so day schools were not working out, and they decided that they wanted to try and separate the children from their families at a greater distance. And so they created industrial schools in about the late 1880s. And for my people, we were mostly sent to St. Joseph's Industrial School, which is more commonly referred to as the Dumbo Industrial School. And there was St. Dunstan, which was the Anglican industrial school, and it was more commonly referred to as the Calgary Indian industrial school. And so these schools were, hundreds of miles away from the children. And parents didn't really enjoy that because they didn't get to see their children. And so it was really hard on the families. A lot of the children were running away from the industrial schools. And at that time, it actually wasn't mandatory for children to have to go to industrial schools. They did have a choice of going to day schools or to industrial schools. So it really depended on what was written in the Indian Act. And so the Indian Act is really, plays a central role in the way that education is taken up for Indigenous people.
Now I have a gigantic and difficult phrase to begin this sentence, but maybe if you listen to the end of the sentence, it might be a little less difficult. Leaving aside for just one moment, and I know that's extremely difficult, but leaving aside the horrors that we've heard about, I see this sometimes in the context of fads in education. You talk about an industrial school, the humorous notion that Indigenous people needed to leave their way of life and go into industries, and the also humorous and easily mocked notion that they needed to be taught agriculture by settlers when they'd been performing agriculture for 10,000 years. I mean, really, in retrospect, some of this is more sketch comedy than anything. You mention all these different types of schools. We've had in all school systems outdoor ed, getting students in earlier, getting students in later. Laurier Lapierre did a study of that in Ontario, leave students out of school till they're 8. whole language, creative spelling, new math. I mean, you have a doctorate in education, and I took an education degree too. The fads and pendulum swings are in some respects ridiculous, compounded by the horrible things that happened in Indian facilities. What do you say about that?
It really does seem like it would be, you could consider a pendulum swing in the way that Indigenous education was, except the intention always stayed the same. The intention was always to assimilate Indigenous children, but they had to find, or the government was trying to find ways of more effectively trying to assimilate Indigenous children. So they came up with these different school models, and the way that they implemented education was very different depending on what decade, what the policies were, and what type of school model they were using.
And at some thin slices of history in time, assimilation or integration or not separate but equal were considered enlightened. And some people just must have not bothered to think about the damage they were doing to history and culture when they said, well, let's just give these poor kids 3 square meals a day, teach them English, French, and how to write, and life will be better for them. They hadn't thought that through, had they?
Well, I think the intention was always, if you read all of the policies that the Canadian government had come up with, it was always to get rid of the culture. So it was always to assimilate and get rid of Indigenous people so that they were Euro-Western Canadian citizens. And
Well,
so,
yeah, no doubt, and no doubt that filtered through a lot of people who deluded themselves, perhaps, in thinking they were doing well. Now, you use a phrase in your article here, and that is an intergenerational survivor. And I assume that means just what the word means: is that your parents and/or grandparents also went to these facilities. Is that true?
yes, yes. My mother went to residential school along with her siblings. My grandparents went, and so forth. So I had family members who went to the day schools back when they first opened in the 1880s, family who went to industrial schools, family who went to the first residential schools, as well as the residency schools. And then again, they circled back to day schools again in the 1950s. So my family's attended all of them.
Now, apparently, the great Indigenous architect Thomas Cardinal has actually said he benefited from his experience. Now, it's hard to believe, as Shakespeare said, that nothing is good or ill, but thinking makes it so, or the experience makes it so. Do you find there was any good in this misguided policy?
It's really hard to say. When you do talk with survivors who went through it, they will tell you that they learned certain things that, and I hate to say is beneficial, because the way that the Canadian government and the way that the schools were run didn't do it in the best way. So, they might have been able to learn skills that they are using today, but just the way that the government and the religions went about it was, very negative. It was, they could have done it in a different way that would have had, more positive results for the children who went through that.
Well, I have yet another critical perspective of those people who were running the facilities, and it comes from, of all places, Fred Sasakamose's book. We make a big deal out of hockey in this country, and sometimes hockey leads the news, and everybody's talk about hockey. And this great player who played a dozen games for the Chicago Blackhawks in the 50s played with a broken tree branch and a frozen cow patty, um, and skates that didn't fit him. I mean, these people, the government and the churches, couldn't even run a facility. Uh, they, a basic facility that fed and clothed and had a sports program and what have you. And we think we've cherished and value hockey. And one of these great players is playing with a broken tree branch and a cow patch. I just found that astounding. They weren't even competent, in other words. What was your experience? was it good, bad, or indifferent? And I know the assimilation part is very bad, but was there anything about the curriculum or the sports program or the building or what have you that measured up in any way?
I think I can't speak as a survivor because I'm not a survivor. I'm an intergenerational survivor. And so it's just hearing stories from family members about going through that. They did have sports programs, but in order to, get to the sports programs, there were so many other things that you had to put up with so that you could play sports that made it a very negative experience for the children who went through that.
You talk about this quite hurtful phrase, which in some other context might not be as hurtful. There are degrees of hurt, but it's why don't you just get over it? And I think that this is something that Don Cherry said, and finally he said too many things and he's left the airwaves now. Saying that, using that phrase is about as relevant as saying, well, why don't you just get over diabetes? Well, I mean, you could lose weight, you could change your diet, but I mean, if you can't get over a broken arm without setting it and so on. So you talked about your personal need to explore the intergenerational effects in order to come to terms with it. There's another word, by the way, I don't like, and that is closure. Do you ever close on these events? I don't think so. They remain part of your life. But talk about your personal quest, if you don't mind.
Sure. Ever since I was a little child, I've always been asked the question, why can't you just get over it? And it's a very loaded question, and it's something, as a child, I couldn't really um, explain or articulate, especially when I didn't really understand what was going on around me. It was something that I noticed. I could feel, it was almost tangible. You could see what was going on with family members as well as my tribe, but not really understanding, the whole history and the context of what has happened with Canada and Indigenous peoples. And so it's something that I've always wanted to better understand. And as an intergenerational survivor, not having actually experienced going to a residential school, it made it really hard. Survivors don't really talk about their experiences. The education system doesn't, educate about residential schools or this history of colonization that we do have in Canada. And so I felt that it was really important that if we want to be able to heal as Indigenous peoples, as survivors, as intergenerational survivors, that we really need to be able to better understand these past events and how it has shaped our present circumstances. So I,
So, if I may delve into that just a little more, what does not getting over it look like? Is it post-traumatic stress disorder? Is it, racial stress memories, which I think some people are doing some research about? Is it something in the diagnostic and statistical manual, or is it just finding it really difficult to come to terms with the Canadian life you've been thrust into?
I'd have to say I feel like it's the trauma. We're all living with the trauma of being colonized, the trauma of having to go through these school systems, but not really understanding what has happened that has led us to this trauma so that we can then begin to look at ways that we can heal from it. If you don't know what happened, how do you heal from it? We have survivors, and we use the terminology self-medicating oneself from experiencing the types of traumas that they went through in these schools. And as intergenerational survivors, the children who are being raised by a generation who went through these horrible experiences, that is the way that we see how to cope ourselves. And so it's just kind of this ugly cycle that gets passed down generation to generation. And so being able to confront and see what has happened, I feel would put us in a better place and situation to be able to heal and find ways that we can live more healthier lifestyles with what has happened.
Scholar Blackfoot Tiffany Prete, consultant or making a submission to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, educator, teacher. Thank you for your perspective. I, anyone who questions the self-medication or the drug abuse and such that we hear about on reserves should take a look at the opioid crisis in America. More prescriptions for opioids were written in the state of Michigan than there are human beings living in Michigan. And there have been doctors fined, sued. There have been consulting companies with famous names coaching the pharmaceutical companies on how to combat the mothers whose children are dead as a result of these things. So to give a nod to Dr. Alfred, whose first name I can't pronounce, but I'm sure you know, he's a Mohawk scholar in Victoria right now. In his book, he says, anyone who has seen the devastation of the economy and how that has harmed people, he says, I guess we're all Indians now, hey? Meaning that there is some sort of common experience now, and it's a horrible experience, but I will stop nattering about that, but I think that people should have an open mind and an open heart about those things. Let me give you an open-ended question before I ask you some other ones, because it's a great opportunity to speak with you. Any other comment about these residential facilities that you studied, that you were in, that you've made submissions about and written about, because it's a great opportunity to hear from you on that.
I think it's really important for people to know the Canadian government used two main assimilative tactics to try and assimilate Indigenous children. So they did have the assimilation through segregation and then assimilation through integration. And so there was a time where Indigenous children were segregated and they stayed on their reserves to be educated, and the Canadian government had hoped that within enough generations that these Indigenous children would learn to be, Euro-Western Canadians, so that we wouldn't have Indigenous peoples today, that we would have reserves no longer in existence. And it wasn't working out the way that the Canadian government had planned, and that's when they went to assimilation through integration. So they were sending Indigenous children off reserve to go to school with Euro-Western children, hoping that being within non-Indigenous children, that it would rub more off on them, I guess the Canadianness, and hoping that when children would go home in the evenings with their parents, that it would also rub off on their parents. So they thought the integration would be an easier way to try and assimilate Indigenous children. And so, it's still something that we are facing today. A lot of people talk about it like this is something that's happened in the past, but it's something that we are still having to live with, and something that is still affecting us today.
Indeed, as William Faulkner said, it's not actually the past. It's still with us. And for those who say, for example, during protests, what about the rule of law? We should have the rule of law. And I like to point out that it should be laws plural, because there are many, many laws, including Indigenous laws. And in the case that we're talking about, there were things like kidnapping, failure to provide the necessities of life, jailing parents for wanting to be with their children, assault, sexual assault, murder. So the rule of those laws might have been good as well. However, I'm interviewing you. I'm not trying to lecture you. Can I get into a couple of I think, interesting topics that you're uniquely qualified to talk about? And one is this business of renaming things, and especially in the U.S. South, they're taking down statues of Confederate soldiers, and many of those people owned slaves, and hard for Americans to get away from Thomas Jefferson or Lincoln's first inaugural, in which he offered to enshrine slavery in the Constitution. My point is about John A. Macdonald, who is a controversial figure and has been for a long time in Indigenous culture. But this book by Richard Gwynne notes that he did certain things that would have been considered unusual, if not enlightened, in the day. For example, socializing with Indigenous people, approving of mixed marriages, defending a Mohawk man charged with murder, giving Indigenous people the vote. And then I think, well, wait a minute, that was a lot of that was part of an assimilation tactic as well. But on the topic of nothing is completely good or evil, what's your view of somebody like John A. Macdonald?
I know that there's been a lot of controversy about him in Canada, wanting to take down his statue and not to teach about him in our history books. And I think it's important that we still remember what our past is. Like we should still remember Johnny MacDonald, but remember him for exactly what it is that he has done. There is this article that was recently published with Dr. Cindy Blackstock, who, and I can't remember the name of the cemetery, but they went around into the cemetery that had some of the government officials, as well as, I can't remember the name off the top of my head. The man who wrote, I think it was the Davin report, who kind of blew the whistle on the way that residential schools were being run, and that it was very, very poorly run, and that something needed to be done about that. And so in the cemetery, they went around and made headstones that talked about these men and really what their true history was, instead of portraying them as very heroic and these wonderful men. We should remember who they are, but exactly what role they have played in our history and the way that it has affected our current society, including Indigenous peoples. So we shouldn't get rid of that part of our history. We just need to remember those men for exactly what role they did play.
Well, and the women, the nuns, and the other leaders who implemented these policies. I think you might have been referring to the doctor who wrote a report to the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs in about the teens or the 20s, saying, these children are not dying of TB because they're Indian. They're dying through neglect and poor diet, lack of fresh air. The stuff that we knew substantially about in those days. Fresh air, sunshine, exercise, diet does help. And I guess the deputy minister said, well, that's tough. Now, I have another controversial thing. I'm old enough to remember many controversies involving the RCMP. They produced a machine to try to determine whether someone was, in the phrase of the day, homosexual in the 60s. They burned a barn in Borden, Quebec, to prevent a meeting of suspected FLQ members. They did all this because, as journalist Jeff Sallet said in his book, nobody said no. So there have been excesses in the RCMP for many years. Ken Daschuk produced this wonderful book called Clearing the Plains. He's a professor at the University of Regina, and he notes, ironically, that it was the Northwest Mounted Police who, in part, helped rid the territory of smallpox through its use of medicine and physicians and taking them around and what have you. And then, we're seen as the savior of the Indigenous people and then the scourge of the Indigenous people. Pretty tough history to come to terms with when you have some people who've done such horrible things and yet have done some decent things. Any thoughts on the RCMP? I think that the most ironic thing, forgive my interrupting your answer, but the most ironic thing is the RCMP may take the lead in some investigations regarding residential facilities when they were the truant officers at the time. That's a pretty rough prescription.
Great. And it's been interesting looking at my people's history with the Northwest Mounted Police and later the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as well. And it's been really, really interesting. I did have the opportunity to read one of the journals of a man who worked in the Northwest Mounted Police with my people, who later became an Indian agent actually on my reserve, and it does make it very interesting. There does seem to be kind of this division in the way that the residential schools were run, and the Northwest Mounted Police and the role that they played.
Let me deal with two of your research areas, if you don't mind. You deal in Indigenous research methodologies. Now, I've done a lot of research, and I realize that some people do research in different ways, but you normally go to a library and open up a book and get a citation and put a bibliography, as you've done in your writing. But you may do ethnography, which is interviewing people. As a British professor of mine once said, "What's that, running around talking to blokes?" Well, yeah, kind of. That's what it is. And I'm aware of the shopping of an idea around in circles and talking to elders and what have you. But educate me just a bit on what Indigenous research methodologies are.
Sure. So, the university was really not created for Indigenous peoples. It's been created for non-Indigenous peoples, and it really privileges non-Indigenous peoples as well. So, myself going into university, going into graduate studies, I remember taking my very first research course, and it was in Western research. And I didn't really identify with the concepts that were being taught. It didn't really fit within my own way of being as an Indigenous person. And then I learned that there was being created an Indigenous research methodology around the world from Indigenous scholars who also had the very similar dilemma when they went to graduate studies, not being able to really identify with any of the different research paradigms or methodologies that were out there. And so there has been this articulation of what is Indigenous research by Indigenous scholars, and it's really principles to live by and to consider when you do your research that privileges Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, and privileges the voices of Indigenous peoples that have historically been marginalized and abused by Western research. And so an Indigenous research methodology, as I said, it's principles to live by that you integrate into your research, but it's really about being able to integrate your own people's ways of knowing, being, and doing into the research process so that you are able to privilege your own people's ways of knowing and being, and privilege your participants' voices in the research process.
Okay, let's say in a weak moment you agreed to be my thesis supervisor and you've just given me this bit of direction. I would seek clarification. I said, okay, so this is kind of like William Foote White Street Corner Society, ethnography, maybe not living among the subjects, but interacting with them on a regular basis, listening, multiple interviews with open ears and open eyes. Trying to understand what is important and trying to get rid of preconceptions. And there would be, I would assume, a lot of interviewing and note taking and writing that up and then checking back. Am I on the right track?
It's really dependent upon who you are as a researcher, as well as your own Indigenous community that you're working with. And so you pick the methods that is most appropriate with your own way of being, as well as the people who you're working with. And so it does take some time of study and practice to learn exactly what an Indigenous research methodology is, so that you can implement it in the best way. And there's so many principles that we could talk about Indigenous research methodologies, but it is, you want to pick something and that's going to be looking at the research problem in a balanced way. You want to do everything with a good heart, the way that you approach your work. So it's very much kind of like a ceremony in its own process from start to finish. And with Indigenous research, we don't really say that there is a finish because it's based on relationships. And relationality is so important in Indigenous research that even when you do finish your research projects, you still have that responsibility to your research, to your participants as well. So it's kind of this responsibility that you decide to take on for the rest of your life.
Well, I was smiling a little bit there. I don't know if you noticed when you said approaching your research with a good heart, and I don't think it is too far off reality to use this piece of academic humor. If you've ever submitted an article for peer review, you know that many academics don't have a good heart and they don't want to publish your piece, but I get your point. Let me say that in an oral history project in New Brunswick and Maine, I'm looking to video record people, so-called snowball interviews. Who else knows something about this? Putting pictures of artifacts on the web and saying, does anyone remember any stories from elders, knowledge keepers, ancestors? What did you use this for? And then see where that goes. Is that a good start?
And I think it's really important that when you're working with a group of Indigenous peoples, especially if it's on a reserve, that you first seek permission from the chief and council, that you do have permission to come into this community and to work with that community before you start asking community members questions. If the chief and council support you, the community members will most likely support you as well. So it's really hard to just go in there and start researching. It's so important to be able to build those relationships first, and I think that you'll find that the quality of your data is so much richer as you build those relationships before asking questions.
Well, that's indeed where I did start, and going to proceed in the way described. And I think there'll be some bumps along the road, but I check in with the chief on a regular basis. Let me get into another area of your research, and it's leadership. And I'm smiling again because if you take a look at the Harvard Business Review, leadership, I almost said traditional, sorry, what is considered mainstream leadership in academic life is, things like Enron and executives in jail and mergers and acquisitions destroying value in 84% of the cases, multiple earnings by senior management, multiples of what the average wage earner earns. I mean, it's really a mess. And the notion that there is a distinguished field of leadership in European, North American, and even Japanese management, which seems a little better, is a bit laughable. So where do how do you approach leadership, and is it from an Indigenous perspective? And is there a perspective you can share with me?
Well, leadership is not really my area of expertise. And within an Indigenous context, specifically to my people, we had our own governing systems before we were colonized, before non-Indigenous peoples came and settled here. And the Canadian government actually made a law in the Indian Act to take away our governing systems. And so today we are not following our traditional way that we would govern ourselves. And it's incredible that we are living in the day and age that we are, and Indigenous people still do not have the right to be able to use their traditional ways of being, to be able to govern ourselves and to be able to follow our own leadership. And it would be nice to be able to at least have that kind of freedom, but it is still part of the Indian Act.
Well, I appreciate your time, and I'm going to hearken back to your original locating us in geography and in history with the Blackfoot and the Blood Reserve. And I would say that you obviously own Drumheller, the Calgary Tower, parts of the beautiful Bow River, Pioneer Village, I think in Edmonton, and a lot of places that I've been. And it is nice to meet you, and it's nice to hear about your history and language and culture.
Thank you very much again for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to sit here and have this chat with you.
Well, mine, and would you say goodbye in your own language, please?
Gitamatsan.
And what does that mean?
We don't really have a word in Blackfoot for goodbye, and so it's kind of like until we see you again, or relationships again. The language is very based in relationships. And so it's, and until we see each other again, kind of that kind of sentiment.
Well, that's perfect. After a nice long interview with me, if you ever want to see me again, I'll be very happy, and we can have another chat. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.